fourth lesson is reasons for industrialization, population growth, land availability, and railroads. Mr. Suter and I are continuing on our long list of different things you need to understand contributed to the rise of American exceptionalist industrialization. Okay, so let's just crack on. Some good stories to tell you about in this particular lesson. So the first one we're going to look at is population growth. Obviously, rapid economic expansion needs lots of people to work in it. That's pretty much a no-brainer, and that sort of basic point is really, should be the starting point of any explanation of how population growth meant. Helped industry. This created, of course, ample supply of labor and consumers. Okay, so not only did the amount of people coming into the United States and the high birth rate lead to a bigger market, it also gave the labor needed to sort of foster the industries that would provide for this larger market. So the major reason for this growth lay in increased incomes. Okay, incomes mean better food, better housing, as well as advances in public health, meaning people live longer and medical knowledge that lower death rates. You have more people in America being born, moving in, and living longer than ever before. Ergo, those people need supplies, and the market was there to feed it. What's more, there's an incredibly high, and this is probably the biggest contributor to population growth, level of immigration to the United States in the later part of the 19th century. The fact here, between 1866 and 1915, approximately 25 million people moved to the United States. It is arguably, and historians are challenged to find a more, I suppose, well-known example, the greatest mass migration in human history. More people are on the move from Eastern and Southern Europe primarily to across the ocean to the United States as their primary port of call than at any other time previously in the history of the world, far exceeding anything we experience today. Of course, to reiterate the point, these people help provide the labor force needed for the expansion of this period. These people come, they want to work, they want to make a decent living, they want to contribute to America, they want all of the things effectively promised to them in the American dream. And the majority of immigrants, and it would be wrong to say that they equally dispersed across the country, but the majority of immigrants thinking that they would go and enjoy the expanse of America basically get sucked up into the industrial Northeast. They provide the bulk of the workforce there, and steel, for instance, some of Carnegie's plants, 27,000 people. They spoke as many as a dozen different languages in those factories. When people arrive in a new country, they usually carry not much more than what they can put on their backs. And as a result, when they arrive in America and they end up getting jobs and coming to society, sometimes with some money in their pocket, they need to acquire things right away. Okay, these consumers need food, they need coal to heat their homes, they need new clothes. And this demand of people getting off the boat feeds growth at an exceptional rate. And there's little doubt, historians basically have little doubt that the immigrant workforce greatly helped the industrialization of the USA in the late 19th century. I'm going to arguably say it's a contributing factor and probably not the most important one, but it's a very significant factor for expansion of American industry at this particular time.
So the next one is the availability of land. And this confuses people, but that's actually very simple. By having more land, you can stimulate demand. And all of these come back to that same point. So what do we mean? Between around the 1870s and 1880s, the US takes the land, which is always there, to its west, but didn't really have much of a population there. And people start moving out westwards. And obviously, if you have a brand new settlement, you need all the infrastructure and you need all the stuff to survive on the margins of society. So that's stuff like barbed wire, kettles, railway tracks to get their guns. But as well as that, as these societies become bigger, then obviously more advanced consumer goods. So basically what you're doing is you're creating a market and therefore creating demand for more types of stuff. And therefore the US manufacturers, because there is this market for these weapons, for this steel, for this railway tracks, will then start opening factories and the factories get bigger. An important thing to realize as well is that most of these areas, at least primarily in this period, are rural, and their primary thing they give back is food. Why is that important? Well, as Mr. Rain correctly pointed out, there is a massive rise in immigration. If the max amount of food available stays the same and the population of mouths gets higher, the price of food would go up. That means that people have less money in their pocket to buy stuff. But if you open up loads of loads of farms, then you supply more food to balance and even go more than that. Food prices stay low, and if food prices are low, people have extra money to buy stuff from US factories. Again, helps demand. It's more of an advanced point, but still relatively basic. Some of the land is super fertile, and then if we have a couple of small farms, that's mostly sort of around the Great Lakes area. The more you get into the west, the harder the soil is, the harder the weather is. So to make it profitable, you need big farms. That's not necessarily a bad thing, particularly as in order to work those massive farms, you need tractors, you need plows, etc., all of which is a new market. If you want to start a farm in the middle of,
Idaho.
So you did that. Idaho. Then you need a train line to get you there, obviously, but you need like chemicals for fertilizing. You need factories, you need plows, etc., and all of that creates a market, and therefore, if there's demand for it, factories will join it. Okay, and that food goes out. And the important thing to realize is now that food goes out, that much of that food is exported and sold to other countries, which in turn means that there's money coming into the economy, and therefore that money can be better spent on those farmers buying stuff from factories. Those factories get richer in return. So almost, when big farm makes food gets sold to foreigners, English people, should we say? That money then goes that the farmers have earned, buy stuff from American factories. So again, pushes demand.
Okay, one thing that a lot of students tend to forget is that land has two components. Number one, availability of land provides food, it increases demand, it's a draw for people to come here. But secondly, availability of land also yields incredible raw materials. It's important to note that very much unlike any other country, well, there are a couple exceptions, Russia, China, perhaps even to a small degree Canada at this particular time, is self-sufficient, i.e. the United States has within its geographic boundaries almost in every natural resource it needs for industrialization to succeed at the end of the 19th century. However, it's very important to note that natural resources alone are not enough to guarantee economic expansion. Russia doesn't expand even though it has an abundance of resources. China is pretty much medieval at this particular time, even though it has an abundance of resources. Railroads are necessary to get these resources to and from the places in which they are. So the mountains rich with copper, for instance, in order to ship from the Rocky Mountains to the eastern industries that will refine this copper, you need railroads. So that's a part of it. And there is also that you have to say there and consider the fact that the natural resources do provide the materials for expansion, i.e. they are a foundation piece. You do not have industry unless you have an abundance of coal. Now, here is the point that is sort of the more advanced thinking point, or the advanced point on natural resources. What everybody gets, if you have the stuff, then you can build things. Right? Yeah, that makes sense. But where it gets a little bit more complicated is its relationship to tariffs. As we know, the United States has incredibly high tariffs. It charges foreign produced goods a lot of money to enter into the US market. Taxes can reach almost up to 50% during the Gilded Age on things produced outside of the United States. One of the reasons the Americans are able to do that, and that say Britain is not, is because the Americans do not have to import raw materials in order to keep their factories running. Britain has an abundance of coal, but it doesn't have an abundance of other things such as iron, copper, timber. So it has to import those things, and to import them, it has to keep its tariffs down, or else the cost of those things necessary for industry to grow are become incredibly expensive, prohibitively expensive. So Britain has to keep its tariffs down. The United States doesn't have to do that. It can raise tariffs as high as it wants because it has to import nothing in order for its industry to work. And this gives the Americans an advantage that, just say, its greatest industrial competitor, Britain, does not have.
So the link to that is obviously transportation and railroads. So what this means is, as Mr. Ray explains, having raw materials alone are not enough. They need to go to the factories, and the goods need to go back out again for the market. So you need to get raw materials into the industrial northeast, and then the stuff they make back out to sell. Otherwise, it's pointless. You need to also get to the food you make to the ports in the east in order to sell it. Therefore, you need railways. Now, the USA did have a load of railways even before 1900, mostly down the coast on the east side. What we see between 1870 and pretty much in this course, but mainly 1910, 1920, is the almost like spider legs, the railways expand outwards, and they're pretty much joining almost every major city by rail. This is essential to make a market and make the most of the geographical resources and the people who are out in the various areas of America. And so therefore, without railways, we would just not see the spread of industries, a range of industries and a range of raw materials. And so I would really characterize railways not as a direct cause in themselves, but they enable everything else to happen. They enable everything to grow, and they enable everything to be made the most out of it. Yes, people would still probably go to the West without railways, but not nearly as many, and they wouldn't make nearly as much money.
So why did railways grow so massive? So here's a few stats for you. In 1865, there were only 35,000 miles of track, but by 1900, there's a five-fold increase. Almost 200,000 miles of track are laid, and there are lots of reasons for this. Number one, huge private investment. Investors, rich and poor, pump their money into railways. It's a really good way to increase your personal wealth.
A really key point on this is initially the government basically gave free land to railway companies in order to go there. This is really important because what happens is railway companies don't take that free land, but bankers do, and they make a load of money taking that free land at cheap prices, selling the land on the either side for a bomb, and then giving the land to railway people at a discount. So they basically made a massive profit, which they then use to spend on factories beyond that.
Yeah. A couple other things, as Mr. Suter mentioned, there you have public subsidies in terms of land grants. The United States literally gives away to railroad companies 130 million acres of farmable soil by the year 1870 as a compensation. So they're not going to pay for the building of the railway that's going to connect San Francisco to Chicago, for instance. Rather, they're going to say, well, it will be built with private money, but in return, we'll give you all of this land, which, of course, they flip to bankers and everybody profits all over the place. You get huge tycoons. It's really important. The growth of railways needs to be linked to the Vanderbilt family, the most famous railroad family of all probably in history. The Vanderbilts make an enormous sum. Cornelius and his son William make an enormous sum expanding railroads from New York, where they have their initial hub, all the way to the Midwest. And with this expanding market that comes with people moving to the West, it creates a need to move goods quickly, especially food. One of the best examples is, these big ranches for cattle that begin sort of in Texas, Oklahoma, in Missouri, these sort of very famous areas where American cattle are reared. These cattle are shipped on railroads to central processing places like Chicago. Here's a really interesting case study. Chicago is a city that's really grows on the back of the meatpacking trade. And now if you've been to Chicago, it's very cold in the winter. It's not necessarily the greatest place to, let's say, have a cattle range, but Chicago becomes the home of the meatpacking industry. It's right smack dab in the middle of the country, and with trains that can move livestock around very quickly, and more importantly, trains that can move butchered meat around very quickly, Chicago becomes the hub of the meatpacking industry. Prior to rail, it would have been inconceivable that a city 1,000 miles from the eastern states would be the nation's sort of meat hub. The meatpacking industry is created by transport, employs hundreds of thousands of people in Chicago at the turn of the century. Chicago today is still referred to as Hogtown. One of the other keys you got to remember too is they also invent refrigeration, which allows frozen meat to travel without spoiling for extra long distances.
And similar to many of the other things, the railways themselves stimulate demand. So how's that happen? Well, the existence of railways means there's these people who work for the railways, both making it, but then also when it's made, driving the trains, doing the signals, etc., etc. Now you have 1 million people with jobs when they didn't have it before. There's 1 million people with money in their pocket who wants to buy stuff from American factories. So again, that's very important to stimulate demand because you've created new consumers. Likewise, as already mentioned, in order to pay for the railways, we see a lot of bankers get involved, and very quickly a lot of bankers make their fortune, which they then turn to other things to help the economy in railways. They borrow land, they sell it, they buy really cheap, they sell it to farmers who want it for much more, and they've made loads of easy money without having to worry about it. Likewise, building a railway stimulates demand of a lot of the industries around it. You need steel for the trains to go on. You need coal to power them. And so what that does is it really drives demand. Loads of factories and loads of coal mines start up. And in that process, there's a lot of competition. Because obviously, people always go buy coal. You might as well try and make a coal mine. And what happens is that drives down prices. in order to be more competitive. So how do you become more competitive? How do you drive down prices? You invest in technological improvements, new drills, new styles, and you try and invent new ways to make the quality of the steel in particular better. So the big thing to look at is all of this helps make demand greater and helps the economy as a whole. As always mentioned as well, though, it's just as important to help move stuff around and facilitate other factors and distribute what's already existing so that everyone benefits and therefore factories still are able to produce and still have customers to produce to.
Okay, just look a few final words on railroad and scope before we get into the historical debate, because you're probably clearly starting to put together in your head that railroads are pretty darn important to this. The railroads are really the first integrated and much faster transportation system across the United States. Most of the growth of railroads, though, you need to remember, is in the Northeast and the Midwest. If you look at maps of the railroad expansion, you see, huge interconnected, tightly wound spider webs of railroads all through the eastern seaboard and, through the Midwest into Chicago. But from there, passing west, it starts to thin out quite a bit. That said, by the turn of the century, there are 5 intercontinental railroad links. So in other words, 5 lines of iron essentially stretching from the east to the west, not just the one that was initially constructed at the end of the Civil War. Coal and steel, as a requirement of this massive railroad boom, needed in large quantities, as was access to capital to build them. Railroads are incredibly expensive. And a huge railroad organizations that developed, and this is a really important point, also are important because they provide a model. There had never been corporations the size of the railroad corporations. To have millions of people employed in one particular industry is a pretty important thing. And as a result, the Vanderbilt companies, the Vanderbilt railroads, end up becoming mega employers. And they're really some of the world's first mega employers. And the United States is able to develop a system of grand companies, mega employers that really provide a model, a know-how to run giant organizations that don't exist anywhere else in the world. And as a result, railroads are also important in that respect. And that's a really niche point, but a very good one. So against that, it's also important to remember, and it would be probably a folly to say that, and all the railroads were super successful. Most of them weren't, actually. A lot of them lost money after a few years of operation. However, they do raise expectations. Okay, the reality of their construction, the giant enterprise it took, the nature of taming the wilderness, to drive a railroad through the mountains, to drive railroads across bodies of water, to drive railroads across the Great Plains, really, really raises expectations. And it really pushes the United States to come up with new technologies and to industrialize in big ways. So they're quite important. So lastly, let's just talk about the historical debate.
So obviously, the argument whether railways were good or bad has changed and gone back and forth over time. Initially, the core argument was railways were central. The idea that you would allow everyone in the USA or most people, to buy stuff on the national market. So if something is produced in, say, Rhode Island up in the northeast, someone in San Francisco in the far west can buy it. And that means those factories can sell more stuff and therefore more money is made. As well as that, by reducing the cost of raw materials being moved, that means the stuff made of raw material is cheaper because it costs less to transport it, and therefore makes a good made out of it cheaper. So if it costs £1 billion to get some steel from one part to another, the car you build will be really expensive, but that's not the case. As well as that, as already mentioned, they argue that by taking in so much steel and coal, etc., they help those industries. Now that increasingly got attacked, which basically said that actually it didn't really matter that there was a national market. It didn't really matter that market stuff was being able to move because they would have just made their own factories anywhere elsewhere. And there's lots of local factories, particularly over time in those local areas in the West before, and so therefore it didn't really help the East. It may have helped the iron and steel industries. It's quite hard not to say that, really. But actually, even then, that wasn't a big deal because that's only one of many. Now, in reality, that was historians trying to be contrarian more than anything. And we're settled roughly now on this post-revisionist argument, which is the railways were important, and they were important to help make a national market, and they were important particularly for certain cities such as Chicago, which would not have existed without that.
A couple other examples. St. Louis, which becomes a hub to the west, wouldn't exist. It's just a bend in the Mississippi River. It exists because it's that bend in the Mississippi River happens to be a bit narrow, and they can run a train bridge across. So St. Louis really becomes the bridge to the west, the gateway, as the sort of the train lines go through this area of St. Louis. That's another example.
Exactly. But the argument is this is not the be-all and end-all cause. If anything, it required other causes such as the capital market, immigration to do it, and also the increase in production of steel, for example. But they definitely argue it is a factor in there, but it's always linked to or related to other factors. And I would say that for an average essay, this is probably the best place to put an argument.
I would agree. So yeah, railroads, big important thing. Make sure you've got your head around this, the complexities, the good, the bad, and some of the more let's just call them niche arguments about their relative importance, because those are the types of things that moves your, let's say, a 10-mark answer from a 7 to a 10.
Yeah, my favorite one of these, and this one is the food price one. Absolutely important. Everyone misses it. Very good.
Good. All right. See you next lesson.
Bye.